Back, you're watching a special episode of To The Point, and we talk about the forthcoming visit of President Obama as chief guest on Republic Day. In part one, we talked about what this means for Indo-US bilateral relations. We turn now to the wider strategic message this message sends out, as well as what it means for the region as a whole. Let's in fact come to that particular point, Mr. Mansi. What is the message to Pakistan? What is the message to the South Asian region that this visit will send out?
Well, the message to Pakistan is quite clearly the Americans are believing the Indian version, which is that terrorism is coming from Pakistan, the same terrorism that is hurting their interests in Afghanistan. And so the Pakistani narrative is getting less and less credibility in Washington. The bigger, wider message is to China. And I think this is where Mr. Modi has...
I'll come to China in a moment's time. But you do believe that the message to Pakistan is as stark and blunt as you phrased it?
Yes, I think so.
Which is why the Pakistani Prime Minister would be very nervous and apprehensive about this visit.
Well, he's already... I mean, what is he talking about? He's talking about Kashmir and self-determination and so on. It's a broken record. There's nothing new that the Americans are hearing.
Stephen Cohen, although this is President Obama's second visit to India, he hasn't visited Pakistan, although he's promised to do so. How do you therefore read the telephone call from Air Force One to Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif? The Indian paper, The Times of India, calls it a mollifying phone call aimed at assuaging any feelings of hurt or pique in Islamabad. Would you agree with that, or would you say that's a somewhat nasty interpretation?
I think that's probably accurate. I don't think we want to alienate Pakistan, and I think he feels strongly that Pakistan has to be accommodated or dealt with, or perhaps contained. And I don't believe that he accepts the Indian narrative totally. He also accepts the Pakistani narrative, which is that Pakistan is a victim of terrorism. And I think what we're trying to do is influence the debate in Pakistan, among Pakistanis, especially the military and most civilians, about what kind of country they're going to have. It's a profoundly important issue for us, and also for India, and also for China. That is the direction of Pakistan. So it's not a question of either or for us, but a question of moving the countries in a way that the worst elements in Pakistan are contained, and Pakistan begins a transformation. Whether that could happen or not is another issue. I think that's how that's how we should see it.
Now, Sanjay Baru, the striking thing about the statements put out by the White House in Washington and the Pakistan Foreign Office in Islamabad after President Obama had spoken to Nawaz Sharif was that they were different in two critical respects. The Pakistani statement emphasized how Nawaz Sharif had asked Obama to play a role in resolving Kashmir, and also how he hoped that Obama would pay a visit to Pakistan very soon. The White House statement was completely silent on those two issues. In your eyes, are those differences of significance?
Of course they are significant. I mean, after all, I think the message from this visit is that this is a very India-specific visit. But this is not the first time. Don't forget, when President Bush came to India for 5 days, he spent 5 hours in Pakistan. And even the last time President Obama visited India, he didn't go to Pakistan. So this dehyphenation has happened in the American mind. I think often it's in the Indian mind that we are finding it difficult to dehyphenate the relationship. But I think in the American mind, there is to some extent dehyphenation. But I think the significant thing, since you're talking about the strategic relationship in this part of the discussion, is that when you invite a head of government to the Republic Day parade, it's an important message because the Indian armed forces salute the chief guest at the Republic Day parade. And therefore you look at the kind of people we have invited, and in that sense you have an important turning point in the strategic relationship, in the India-US relationship.
I want to come back for a moment to this question of hyphenation and dehyphenation. Sanjay Baru emphasized by referring back to the Bush visit of 2006, and before that you could even quote the Clinton visit of 2000, when he also was barely in Pakistan for a couple of hours, that in American eyes the dehyphenation has happened. But I heard Professor Cohen earlier saying that it's not either or. We need, as he said, America needs to make sure that Pakistan doesn't roll down the road of being a failed state. And clearly, America's dependence on Pakistan may be diminishing, but right through the years they get their troops out, and as they get their equipment out, they need to have Pakistan on side. So, to what extent is that phone call a question of President Obama assuring that the hurt in Pakistan is contained and that there isn't any damage done to his relationship with Islamabad, despite the fact he's chosen to come to Delhi a second time round?
Well, the first thing to understand is that US relations with Pakistan have not been rosy for a while now. Opinion, particularly in the US Congress, has been, as Steve Cohen told us earlier, pretty anti-Pakistan for quite a while now. And I think the administration knows what exactly Pakistan is up to. So it's not even a question of saying whether the United States buys into Pakistan's narrative about where terrorism comes in this region. The simple fact is that the United States needs to work with Pakistan in order to secure its strategic interests. And in so doing, it will naturally make cut against India's interests as far as the region Afghanistan is concerned. So as I said earlier, the challenge for us is to be able to hold the balance and make sure that we can deal with the fallout.
And you're reasonably confident from the way he's playing his hand that Mr. Modi is up to that challenge completely?
Well, I think successive governments in India have managed to do it. I don't see any reason why this one won't.
What about then the message that this visit will send out to Xi Jinping in China? Will the Chinese see this as an attempt to either collaborate with or at least support America's pivot or rebalance in Asia? And could it have an impact on the burgeoning relationship Mr. Modi's been trying to establish with Xi Jinping?
No, I don't think the Chinese necessarily see the Indo-US. They saw the Indo-US relationship up to 2009 as a matter of concern. After that, the sense of drift and the sense that hit the relationship, and the Chinese sentiment that India ultimately was not really able to capitalize on that relationship, and the fact that the Americans themselves played around with China, the G2. There was a 14-month period Obama tried G2, and now that China has since then, in that 5-year period, grown even more powerful economically. It's no longer really, I think, for China to be, China's not really nervous about the idea of India being able to be part of an alliance to contain China. But they are nervous at the possibility of the US and other countries, most notably Japan, coming together and providing something, giving India a type of heft that China would be concerned about. But we are 1/6 China's GDP right now.
So they don't need to worry.
We have a long way to go before China needs to look at us with any real fear.
You're nodding your head. Is it in agreement or disagreement?
Slight disagreement. I think the message is quite clear. For a long time, our own strategic community thought we had two options. We could either go closer to the United States and the Western countries, or we form a New Delhi, Beijing, Moscow axis, because we still have an institution where the foreign ministers meet and talk about the common problems. I think it's quite clear that so far as India is concerned, we are moving closer towards the US and the US allies in our region, in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think the other option is quite clearly out. I think China is worried because China is now beginning to take us a little more seriously than they did because of our proximity to the US. And they're taking our nuclear program a little more seriously because in track 2, we are finding that the Chinese are now beginning to say, yes, I think we should talk about it.
So this is going to actually have a fairly significant impact on the nature of the way China views India and responds to Mr. Modi.
I believe so.
The interesting thing, Professor Cohen, is that the other two heads of government with whom Mr. Modi seems to establish some sort of personal relationship or bond are Shinzo Abe of Japan and Tony Abbott of Australia. And both of them have very close links with Washington. Is there a sense in which one could see a four-way relationship emerging?
You know, Karen, before you start developing new world alliances, I think we have to understand how limited these are going to be. In a sense, we're all in awe of what China's done economically. But what constrains everybody in terms of the relationship, in terms of alliances, is the fact that all these major powers are nuclear weapon states. That gives Pakistan increased value today, because the Chinese are as much worried about Pakistan as they're worried about India's rise. Their ally Pakistan has suddenly turned out to be a liability, both in terms of Xinjiang and also in terms of Afghanistan. So I think we need to look more closely what the Chinese are doing in terms of developing an overall strategic relationship that would encompass Afghanistan and perhaps Pakistan. There, I think India actually shares an interest with China, as do we.
Sanjay Baru, let me put that question to you as well. Given that, in fact, the three heads of government who Mr. Modi has established a rapport with are Japan, Australia and America, and that they're three very close to each other, do you see the possibility of a four-way relationship?
No, first of all, I think the four-way relationship has now come to be. I mean, I agree with Ambassador Lalitman saying that the India-Japan, India-Australia and India-US relationship will be viewed with some element of concern in not just in China but in many other countries. But I think that relationship Mr. Modi has solidified. But I also agree with Steve Cohen, which is that we are now in a world of multiple relationships. And India has its own independent relationship with China. It is not entirely adversarial. We have differences on the border issue, and now we have a new negotiator on the border issue. But on the other hand, Prime Minister Modi has also been reaching out to China. I don't think he would want to have a situation where he does not have a viable relationship with China. But that is India's strength, that we can have a viable relationship with a large number of countries.
Okay.
But when the chips are down, I think the message is that we now have a closer relationship with the English-speaking world, the Anglo-Saxon world, if you like, and there are many other countries that come into that basket.
Very interesting that our relationship with the English-speaking world should be improving, just as our concern about English as a language at home seems to be increasing. But leave that aside. What impact, Srinath Raghavan, will this have on India's traditional relationship with Russia? President Putin is due in Delhi next month. Does the Obama visit suggest that just as India's bonds, traditional bonds with Moscow are weakening or loosening, our relationship with America is improving?
Well, I don't think, once again, it's an either-or case. And in fact, my own hunch is that the government will actually go quite out of its way to woo President Putin when he comes here. Because this is also an opportunity for us to sort of leverage the fact that Russia is once again facing isolation vis-a-vis the West. We do not want Russia to be entirely dependent on China as a counterweight against the West. And the Indo-Russian relationship could be another sort of stabilizing vector in these sort of web of relationships which are being constructed. So I agree with Sanjay Baru. I mean, we don't need to sort of take a view that it is either the United States or Russia, either the United States or China. I mean, our strength is precisely the fact that we are able to leverage these multiple relations.
I didn't mean from our point of view. Would Putin be apprehensive and concerned that we're getting closer and closer to what is for him a traditional opponent, if not enemy?
Well,
no longer enemy.
The Russians have, for some time now been concerned about the fact that the kind of exclusive strategic relationship that India had with Russia in the past is no longer there. But that's just a fact of life, and I think they'll have to learn to live with it.
Now, in a recent article for the Carnegie Endowment, the Indian-American scholar Ashley Teller said that, in fact, the relationship between India and the United States was, he called it, a faltering partnership. He said, as things stand, the US-Indian strategic partnership is in a rut. Do you think in the next 2 months we are going to see India and America getting out of that rut? Has a significant shift happened in that overall strategic faltering partnership?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm correct, he wrote that before the September trip.
Just before.
Yeah. So the September trip itself, I think, was a revelation, because it was, even when Modi had went there was some doubts within the Indian system as to how much traction we could actually get from Obama, not merely because of our experience with Obama the previous years, but also because of the visa problem with Modi, and just the fact that they were not clear that America fitted in with Modi's overall economic agenda, when it was about manufacturing and infrastructure, areas which, frankly, America is no longer competitive in a lot of areas. In these areas, America cannot make infrastructure in India in the way that even a China or Japan can. Whether or not there was going to, but as it is, there was a lot of convergence. Climate change proved to be a convergence. Energy proved to be a convergence. Technology and finance for infrastructure proved to be a convergence. And of course, the American corporate world was something that Modi did a very good job of wooing.
So we're out of the rut for sure.
I think we're now moving into, in fact, a completely different level. And this is what's going to be interesting, as you said, in the between now and January, if we can get very large deliverables, which is what I think Modi and Obama have in mind, then we're going to have the relationship move really to a new level.
Of course, one of Mr. Modi's big concerns is to woo American investment in sizable numbers and in sizable quantity to India. To what extent will they and their attitude to India be helpfully determined and affected by the forthcoming visit? And to what extent will they say, no, we're going to wait to see those second-generation critical reforms in land, in labor, most importantly, taxation issues?
Well, I think a lot of movement has taken place in that direction. Remember that when Mr. Modi went to the US, he tackled 3 separate but interrelated constituencies: the US business constituency, the diaspora constituency, and the American establishment. Now, American establishment controls the investment in the defense sector, which is going to be large, in my view. The US business community is going to come in with the capital and with the technology. And I think there, Mr. Modi has already done a couple of things which will reassure them. Firstly, he has done the TFA, which has created this impression that India and the US are on the same side on a global issue. But more than that, the two priorities which have been announced by Mr. Arun Jaitley in his talk with the PTI, I think day before yesterday. One is that he intends to pass the insurance reform bill, which will increase the cap on FDI in insurance, and the tax, the GST, which will be huge in terms of reform measures. And I think that is setting the ground for American business to come here. Take fresh interest.
Very quickly, Sanjay Baru, I'm going to ask you for a short answer before I go back quickly also to Stephen Cohen. In recent months, India has felt that America is not doing enough to push India's membership in places like the Australia Group, the Wassenaar Agreement, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Now, after this visit, do you think Obama will push it even harder and tougher?
Well, I think that will depend on the defense, what we do in defense. I think this is one area in which there would be some quid pro quo. If we agree to things that would make Washington happy, Pentagon happy, White House happy, I'm sure they would. But I think I just want to say very quickly, on the economic side, I do think we need to do much more at home. I think Mr. Modi has to, next 2-3 months, next few weeks, in fact, focus on the domestic economy. Mr. Jaitley's interview was very important, but we need action, not just because that will please the United States, but because Indian business and all investors are waiting for much more action on the ground.
Absolutely, I'll endorse that, and the only hope that we have that will happen is the interview Mr. Jaitley gave PTI, where he said that in fact second-generation reforms are going to be the big focus of his next budget. We have to wait and see. Very quickly, Professor Cohen, I want to end by coming back to Mr. Modi. In India, Mr. Modi has got a lot of praise for the sure-footed, confident, some would even say inspired way he's handled foreign policy. Literally, no one had expected this of him. How has his handling of foreign policy and his sure-footedness gone down in Washington?
Well, he came here and it was something of a sensation among certain sectors of the United States. Of course, the ethnic community was in love with him. The business community had second thoughts. But really, the visit made very little splash in a wider community. India is still not seen as an important country. But as we've been talking, you've listed a number of issues, a whole range of issues that would have been impossible to think of 10 or 15 years ago. So the relationship is very broad and very complex. There are going to be obstacles, especially in the defense area. I know that. The new defense minister has his work cut out for him. But I think it's much different than it was 5 or even 10 years ago. And I think on the whole, it is going to, I won't say higher plateau, but it's becoming more complex and I think better for both sides.
More complex, but it's also rising to a higher plateau. That is certainly a challenge for both leaders, but at least if it rises to a higher plateau, they might be able to see the horizon ahead more clearly and view the sun as it rises over the relationship more brightly. If that's not being needlessly poetic, perhaps that sums you up adequately. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. My apologies that line to Lisa Curtis simply couldn't come through. And there we end this particular episode. Time.